Welcome back. Shifting gears now from inequality to income and GDP, we have the question of what is gross domestic product. So gross domestic product, or GDP, is a concept that you have probably encountered as a high school student, possibly in other classes that you've taken. We see the concept over and over again. We also hear about it a lot in the media, particularly when we hear policymakers or politicians talking about growth of an economy over time, what sorts of growth they want to see, how they are going to improve things in the US or globally or whatever. So what is gross domestic product actually? Well, gross domestic product, gross refers to aggregate, domestic refers to within one country, and product refers to spending or production. So total income earned in an economy is one way of measuring gross domestic product. Another is in the literal production or sales of new and final goods and services. So what is the value of the stuff that our economy is producing and selling? So here you would potentially see a difference between a country that is mostly producing raw materials that other countries buy and then transform into other products that they sell at higher prices. So a country that predominantly is producing steel will theoretically have a lower GDP than a country that is using steel to produce goods like airplanes or cars or building materials or whatever. And then finally, it measures expenditure on domestically produced goods and services. So how much is everybody in our economy spending on stuff? And we don't distinguish between like good spending, which would be on stuff like cars or houses or clothing or like fun stuff that you would want to spend. We don't distinguish between that and spending on, say, healthcare. So if I have to spend a lot on medical bills, all that spending is going to count towards GDP, but that's not like enjoyable spending necessarily. It's the same deal with cleaning up after environmental crises or dealing with the aftermath of disasters. So any spending by the government or households or firms on goods and services is going to count here towards GDP. Ultimately, what it represents is the size of the economy, how much expenditure is happening. It doesn't tell us anything about the quality of the expenditure. It doesn't tell us anything about the quality of what people are buying, etc. It really just tells us how much spending is happening, how much is being sold in an economy, which tells us quite a lot, but it doesn't necessarily tell us everything about the quality of life, though GDP is often used as a shorthand for how well a country is doing. It's important to note also that there's a certain like subjective element to GDP versus objective components. So when we think about measuring the value of an economy, the price of goods and services for sale matters, as well as the volume of goods and services that are sold. So for some things, it's very easy to measure their impact on overall GDP. If I sell, I don't know, 17 pallets of blueberries in the month of July, it's easy to calculate what that adds to GDP. We calculate the price of the blueberries in the pallets, and we multiply it by the quantity that I've sold, and then we can add that figure to GDP for local community GDP. But it doesn't necessarily tell us if the blueberries that I'm selling have some positive benefit for the environment. Maybe the bees that come and help with the pollination and cultivation of my blueberries are also doing really good things for the environment around. Or alternately, maybe I'm using nasty pesticides in cultivating my blueberries. This measure of the value of what I'm selling doesn't necessarily capture the overall effects on the economy of how I'm cultivating the land, how I'm harvesting these crops, and how I'm actually distributing them to the local economy into the global economy. When we think about GDP, there are several key measures that we think about. So there are ways that we can think about GDP to make it to give us a better sense of the scope of earnings within an economy, and to give us a better framework for comparing GDP in one country with another. One way we do this is by looking at GDP per capita, which basically is averaging GDP across the population of an economy. So, for example, we would assume that an economy with a lot of people would have a larger raw GDP, a larger aggregate GDP than a country with a smaller population of people. You might think about why you would expect that relationship. Why should the US automatically have a larger GDP than Canada, even though these are relatively similar economies with people buying similar bundles of stuff, people with similar technology to produce goods and services and so on. And the reason is that the US has many, many, many more people than Canada. If you have many, many, many more people buying stuff, you will have a larger GDP. So when we want to compare relative performance of the US economy and the Canadian economy, a more effective tool for understanding that is looking at per capita GDP. So if we divide aggregate GDP by population, that gives us a more standardized figure to better compare the relative standard of living or the relative productivity of the US economy versus the Canadian one. Another key variable that we use is thinking about disposable income. So disposable income captures your what you have to spend after you've spent on everything you have to. So specifically, we subtract out expenditure on taxes from people's overall income. And then we might also account for the fact that some people receive transfer payments from the government. So my total income is going to be positively correlated with any transfer payments that I receive, but it's going to be negatively correlated with any expenditure on taxes that I have to do. So disposable income, which is the key determinant of consumption, spending by individuals or households on domestically produced goods and services, is going to link up with disposable income because it's whatever I can spend on after I've paid my obligations. How do governments influence economic outcomes? Well, there are several ways that governments make a difference, especially when we're thinking about GDP. One is through direct payments to households. So this is through the mechanism of transfer payments. So if your household receives Social Security payments or temporary assistance for needy families, that would show up as a positive, as a positive benefit from the government. It would enable you to spend more. We might also think about the government as a source of employment. Lots of people work for the government. Anyone who works for the military, for example, works for the government. Anyone who works for the post office works for the government. I, as a professor at the University of Rhode Island, am actually an employee of the state of Rhode Island. I am a public employee. So the state hires people and pays them wages and salaries. We might also think about services that governments provide. We might think about public goods like defense and semi-public goods like education, which you perhaps learned about in Econ 201 or Intro Micro, as another way that the government shapes the systems in which the economy functions. So when a government pays to improve the roads and reduces the potential wear and tear on your car, that is an implicit way, an indirect way in which the government is shaping economic outcomes. We also think about the government in terms of taxes, in terms of the structure of revenue collection. How is a government paying for the expenditure it engages in? Is it doing so in a relatively progressive way, or is it doing so in a relatively regressive way? Are people paying the government more as their incomes rise, or are people paying the government the same amount regardless of what their income is? And then finally, we think about the government as just a spending institution. The government buys goods and services from firms. The government doesn't hire people to do doesn't necessarily hire employees for every job it needs done. The government might hire a catering service to provide meals in federal buildings. The government may hire an exterminator if there's a bug problem in a state house or something. So the government itself buys goods and services from firms. So these are all different ways in which the government directly and indirectly influences economic outcomes.